It seemed like a normal day at first. I was just walking around when I saw what looked like a disc of some kind on the ground. As I get closer I saw that it's a Blue's Clues DVD. I picked it up and looked at the other side of it and was partially pleased to see that it was hardly scratched at all. "Oh, this will be good for Jordan," I said to myself. I flipped the DVD over and saw written in thick black marker, "Don't watch." Confused and a little concerned, I watched it first before letting Jordan watch it. At first, it seemed like a normal Blue's Clues episode. Then I thought it was weird when I saw that Steve, Blue's co-star of the show, was animated. Then I thought it was just for that episode, but that was when I noticed that the house was worn down, windows were broken, boards were rotted, and there were holes in the walls. Then Steve stuck his head out of one of the windows and said his signature opening line, "Hey out there. It's me, Steve. Have you seen Blue, my puppy?" Only he sounded more irritated rather than his usually cheery character is supposed to sound. It was then that Blue appeared from behind a bush in front of the house, and took off in a sprint toward the backyard rather than going to the front doggy door like she normally did. Steve then disappeared back inside of the house. The screen went to static for a moment and the only sound was the loud, insanely frightening shriek of a dog screaming out in pain. Thinking it was coming from outside, I kept watching. The screen exited the static and entered the next scene. Steve was wearing a black hoodie, black baggy jeans, and black combat boots. It was strange to see Steve dressed that way. And even though his hood was up, I could tell it was him, but I could also tell that something was wrong. An eerie chill crawled up my spine, and I was about to turn it off when a blood-curdling, fear-filled, high-pitched scream blasted through the stereo speakers. The pitch and the volume of it pounded in my ears. It hurt so much that I had to cover them. I thought that they might kill my hearing. It went on for what felt like hours. When it stopped I looked up to see a knife, covered in blood, clutched firmly in Steve's hand. I was confused for a moment. Then I saw the brutally mutilated corpse of the blue-haired, carefree puppy lying lifeless on the floor, blood pooling around her body, her intestines spilling from her belly, the blood looking so real that I almost thought it was coming from the TV. It was then that Steve's brother Joe comes in and sees the aftermath of the event that had just taken place. He screamed so loud that it seemed louder than the first. I covered my ears again but didn't take my eyes off the screen. Joe ran out the door in a terrified sprint, with Steve calmly walking after him. It made me think of something out of a slasher film. Joe ran for what seemed like 10 minutes, then finally came to rest behind a tree to catch his breath. There was no sound at this point, only the faint sound of Joe breathing. There was a snapping noise, like a twig breaking under the weight of someone's foot, behind him somewhere, and he physically stiffened in fear. You couldn't hear any footsteps, the only sound was Joe's heartbeat quickening and pounding against his chest. Then, everything went quiet. The camera view changed and it was as if I was watching through someone else's eyes. They were slowly approaching a tree. When they were directly behind it, the screen changed again, but not to static. It went black. Then all I heard was the sound of a blade piercing skin and a man screaming in intense pain. I knew immediately it was Steve attacking him. Then I heard the sound of the knife piercing Joe's body again and again and again and again. I don't know how many times I heard that sound. The screen was still black then, and I began to see what looked blood trailing down the TV screen. It looked so real, like a bucket of it had been poured on top of the TV. After a moment, the screen went back to normal. The scene before me was enough to make me almost throw up, but I managed to hold it back. The screen had returned to normal now and I was utterly terrified to see that Steve was standing over Joe's remains now, only, he was no longer animated at this point, he was real, and the man on the ground no longer looked like Joe. I'm not even sure if it was Steve. The way his hood was on made it impossible to see the top half of his face. I could clearly see the gleefully twisted smile upon his lips as he looked down upon his handiwork. The camera then focused on the man who I initially thought to be Joe. The image I saw was sickening and I couldn't hold it back anymore and I threw up. It burned to do so. Joe, or the man I thought was Joe, was stabbed what looked to be at least 10 times in the neck, and his stomach was torn open into an X shape and the killer's knife was buried firmly in the poor man's heart. His eyes were torn out and put into his hands, which were crudely cut from his arms, the same for his feet and head. The killer then pulled out the knife and ran at whoever was holding the camera, who, in turn, dropped the camera and I could see it tumbling toward the ground. Fortunately, it had landed facing away from the two people. All I could hear was the cameraman screaming in pain behind his terror-filled cries for help. After a minute, the killer re-entered the camera's view. He pointed at it with a knife and said something angrily yet happily in what, thinking about it now, sounded like Russian. I haven't spoken of this night for years, and I have yet to figure out who left the DVD there. I never reported this DVD to the police, a mistake I will never make again. After watching it, I took it out of the DVD player and snapped it into 2 pieces so that nobody else will ever have to watch it. I still have nightmares about it every now and then. If I could go back in time and stop myself from picking up that disc I would. In fact, I would actually get rid of it right then and there. I have no information on the killer. I have looked up this kind of killing, but I can never find anything that matches this type of brutality. Nowhere.